They said the shed was empty until it started breathing fire. And by the time Staff Sergeant Daniel Harper heard the call over the radio, the sky above the edge of Fort Ridge, Texas had already turned the color of burning copper at dusk. The kind of light that makes even familiar places feel like they are holding their breath. The structure stood about 60 yards beyond the maintenance yard, a small wooden storage shed used for equipment no one checked twice, the kind of place that usually disappears into routine. But tonight it was different. Tonight it was alive with flickering orange light pressing against warped boards and curling through the cracks like it was searching for a way out. Daniel arrived on foot, boots steady against gravel that still held the heat of the day, his posture straight, but his eyes already scanning for something more than just damage. He had served long enough to know that silence before chaos always meant something had already gone wrong. The radio call had been brief, almost hesitant, reporting an accidental ignition, but the tone of the voice behind it carried weight that did not belong to paperwork or procedure. It belonged to instinct. As he closed the distance, the scent of smoke thickened, carrying the sharp bite of charred pine and oil-soaked wood, and with it came something else, a sound so faint it almost folded into the wind. A bark, not loud, not urgent in the way most would expect, but steady, persistent, as if refusing to disappear no matter how much the air tried to swallow it. Daniel stopped 10 feet from the shed, raising a hand instinctively, as if to feel the heat pushing outward. The structure groaned under its own tension, beams shifting, nails complaining under stress, while embers drifted into the evening air like fireflies that had lost their way. Somewhere inside, something was still moving. His mind did not immediately assign fear to it. Instead, it assigned recognition, not of the place, but of the sound. A memory flickered, uninvited, of a different place, a different fire, far from Texas, where voices had once been replaced by static and urgency. He inhaled slowly, grounding himself, then reached for the latch. The door was warped, swollen by heat, resisting as if the structure itself did not want to be opened. Daniel pressed harder, shoulder angled, feeling the resistance give way inch by inch until the wood finally yielded with a sharp crack. The moment it opened, heat rolled out like a wave, but so did the sound, clearer now, closer now, a controlled, deliberate bark that did not carry panic so much as instruction. Inside, the world was reduced to shadows and shifting light. Visibility was low, smoke threading through beams of orange glow that pulsed from the ceiling and walls. He could see outlines of storage crates, overturned tools, and the skeletal frame of what used to be order. And then he saw it, a shape low to the ground near the far corner, partially shielded by a fallen plank, unmoving except for the steady rise and fall of breath. A German shepherd, coat darkened by soot and shadow, eyes reflecting the firelight with a clarity that cut through everything else. Canine Atlas. The recognition did not come from signage or labels. It came from presence. From the way the dog lifted its head the moment Daniel stepped inside, as if it had been waiting not for rescue in general, but for him specifically. Atlas did not rush forward. Instead, he shifted slightly, pressing closer to the floor, body aligned with something beneath or beside him, protective even in stillness. Daniel dropped immediately to a knee, one hand extended, voice low and steady, cutting through the chaos without raising it above calm. The dog responded with a short sound, not a cry, not distress, but acknowledgement, as if confirming what had already been understood between them long before this moment. The heat intensified above them, wood shifting again, a reminder that time was not generous here. Daniel reached forward slowly, eyes locked on the dog, reading every micro movement the way soldiers read terrain. Atlas did not retreat. Instead, he leaned forward just enough for their distance to collapse into trust. Daniel's hand made contact with fur warm from heat and effort, grounding both of them for a brief, suspended second where nothing else existed except that connection. The fire continued its quiet roar around them, but inside that corner of the shed, something else had already begun to form, something that did not belong to destruction. It belonged to choice. And Daniel Harper, still kneeling in the glow of shifting embers, understood that whatever came next would not be about what the fire took, but about what it refused to take completely. Daniel Harper stayed low as the heat pressed against his uniform like a living wall, each second inside the shed narrowing into something measured only by breath and instinct. Atlas did not move away from him. The German shepherd remained close, steady eyes reflecting the shifting orange glow as if waiting for a signal only he could understand. Daniel scanned the interior again, not searching for chaos, but for structure, for anything that explained why a secured storage shed on a United States training facility had become a place of sudden ignition. His gaze caught on the broken latch mechanism near the door frame, twisted in a way that did not look like simple wear or accident. It looked intentional, as if someone had made sure the door would not open easily from the outside. That detail settled in his mind with quiet weight, but there was no time to explore it fully. Atlas shifted slightly and gave a low sound, not of panic, but of readiness, as if reminding him that awareness was not enough without movement. Daniel extended his hand again, this time firmer, guiding the dog closer. Atlas responded immediately, stepping forward with controlled trust, his body brushing against Daniel's leg, as if anchoring himself to something stable in a world becoming unstable. Daniel wrapped one arm carefully around the dog's chest and began to guide him toward the exit. The air near the doorway was still thick, but less dense than the center of the shed, and each step felt like moving through layers of heat and memory at the same time. Outside, the evening had deepened, the sky shifting from copper to a darker blue that seemed almost unreal after the intensity within the structure. When Daniel finally stepped out with Atlas beside him, he paused only long enough to confirm that the dog was steady on his feet. Atlas shook off lightly, as if trying to return to normality through habit alone, then looked back toward the shed with alert focus. Daniel followed his gaze, eyes narrowing slightly as he observed the broken frame, the warped wood, and the unnatural stillness surrounding the scene. It was too quiet for something that had just happened. A voice from the radio broke through the moment, asking for confirmation of status, but Daniel did not respond immediately. Instead, he knelt beside Atlas, placing a steady hand on the dog's shoulder, grounding both of them in the present. The contact was familiar, not new, as if their connection had always existed in moments of pressure rather than calm. For a brief moment, Daniel's mind drifted back to training fields at Camp Pendleton, where Atlas had first been assigned to him as a young military working dog with more curiosity than discipline. Back then, Atlas had been quick to learn, but even quicker to observe, reacting not just to commands but to emotion, hesitation, and intent. Daniel remembered long mornings of repetition under coastal wind, where obedience drills blended into something closer to conversation than instruction. Atlas had never been the type to respond mechanically. He responded to presence. That memory sharpened Daniel's awareness of the present moment, and he looked again at the shed with a more critical eye. The ignition point did not feel random. The placement of items inside, the way the door had resisted, even the timing of Atlas being alone inside, all of it formed a pattern that did not belong to chance. He stood slowly, keeping one hand on Atlas as if ensuring the connection remained unbroken, and began to circle the perimeter of the structure. The ground around the shed was disturbed in subtle ways, footprints partially softened by heat and ash drifting outward. Nothing dramatic, nothing obvious, but enough to suggest someone had been here with purpose. Atlas followed closely, never straying more than a step away, occasionally pausing to look toward the tree line beyond the maintenance yard as if sensing something beyond what Daniel could see. The United States Marine Corps facility lights in the distance began to activate as evening protocols engaged, casting a cooler white glow over parts of the yard that contrasted sharply with the fading warmth of the fire's aftermath. Daniel stopped near the back of the shed where a small metal container lay half exposed beneath fallen debris. He crouched and examined it carefully, noticing that the latch was intact, but the placement was unnatural, as if it had been moved recently. He did not open it yet. Instead, he focused on Atlas, watching the dog's reaction. Atlas stared at the container, then back at Daniel, then gave a single controlled exhale through his nose, a behavior Daniel recognized from past missions as alert confirmation rather than curiosity. Whatever had happened here was not just about fire. It was about timing, access, and intention. Daniel stood again, the weight of that realization settling quietly in his posture. The wind shifted slightly, carrying the last remnants of smoke upward into the darkening sky. Atlas pressed closer, his shoulder touching Daniel's leg again, steady and present. In that quiet space between investigation and uncertainty, Daniel understood that the moment they had just stepped out of was not an ending. It was the beginning of something that would require more than instinct to understand. The evening at Fort Ridge, Texas had settled into a tense quiet that felt heavier than normal, as if the air itself was waiting for answers that had not yet been given. Daniel Harper remained near the shed, standing beside Atlas with a stillness that came from years of learning how to listen to silence more than sound. The United States Marine Corps facility lights in the distance cast long, clean lines across the gravel yard, but none of that brightness reached the questions forming in Daniel's mind. Atlas stayed close, his posture calm but alert, eyes moving between Daniel and the dark outline of the damaged structure as if trying to reconstruct what had just happened through memory alone. Daniel finally broke the silence, speaking softly into the evening air, not as an order, but as a thought shaped into words. Something does not add up here. Atlas responded with a subtle shift of weight, a behavior Daniel had come to recognize over time as agreement rather than instruction. The German Shepherd was not simply reacting to environment. He was processing it, reading it in layers that human perception often missed. Daniel walked slowly back toward the shed, careful not to disturb the ground more than necessary. The smell of smoke was fading, replaced by the cooler scent of evening grass and distant pine trees lining the perimeter fence. He crouched again near the metal container he had noticed earlier, this time studying it more closely. The latch was simple, standard issue, yet its placement suggested deliberate handling rather than accidental displacement. Atlas approached and stopped just behind him, watching quietly. Daniel placed one hand on the container, but did not open it. Instead, he looked at Atlas and noticed something new in the dog's expression, a focused stillness that indicated recognition rather than curiosity. It was the same expression Atlas had shown during training scenarios involving unknown stimuli, when instinct and memory worked together without hesitation. Daniel stood again, exhaling slowly, then turned his attention toward the open yard beyond the shed. The maintenance area stretched out in neat sections, marked by gravel paths and storage units, all designed for order and predictability. Yet tonight, there was a fracture in that order, subtle but undeniable. He began walking the perimeter once more, this time slower, allowing Atlas to lead slightly ahead. The dog moved with quiet precision, pausing near the edge of a set of tire tracks that cut across the yard in a direction that did not match standard facility routes. Daniel knelt beside them, studying the pattern. The tracks were faint but fresh enough to suggest recent activity, and their direction led toward a service gate that was usually locked after sunset. Atlas stood at the edge of the tracks, looking forward, then back at Daniel, as if confirming that the path mattered. Daniel placed a hand gently on the dog's shoulder and followed the direction of the tracks with his eyes. There was no urgency in his movement, only a growing awareness that whatever had taken place was not isolated to the shed. It was part of something larger, something that extended beyond what had already been seen. The wind shifted again, carrying with it the distant hum of facility generators and the faint rhythm of routine operations continuing unaware of the disruption nearby. Daniel straightened and began walking toward the service gate, Atlas immediately matching his pace. As they moved, Daniel reached for his radio but paused before speaking. He was not yet certain what needed to be reported and what needed to be understood first. The gate came into view ahead, partially illuminated by overhead lights that flickered slightly in the evening breeze. The lock was intact, but the ground beneath it showed subtle disturbance, as if someone had passed through recently without fully disturbing the structure itself. Atlas stopped at the gate and focused forward, ears slightly raised. Daniel joined him, placing one hand on the metal frame, feeling its cool surface contrast with the lingering warmth of the day. He looked down at Atlas and saw the dog's attention fixed beyond the gate, toward the darkness outside the facility boundary. For a moment, neither of them moved. The quiet between them felt deliberate, as if the world had narrowed into a single shared point of awareness. Daniel finally spoke into the radio, his voice steady and controlled, requesting a quiet perimeter check near the maintenance yard and service gate. Then he lowered the device and returned his attention forward. Atlas remained still, but his posture had changed slightly, no longer reactive but fully engaged, as if preparing for the next phase of understanding rather than action. Daniel exhaled once, slow and measured, then looked out beyond the gate where the night had fully settled. Whatever had begun at the shed was no longer contained by it, and both man and dog stood at the threshold of something that would require patience, trust, and attention to details that had not yet revealed their full shape. The night at Fort Ridge, Texas had deepened into a quiet that felt less like peace and more like a held breath across the entire installation. Daniel Harper remained at the service gate with Atlas positioned slightly ahead of him, both of them facing outward toward the darker stretch of terrain beyond the controlled lights of the United States Marine Corps facility. The radio on Daniel's shoulder crackled softly with routine updates from other sectors, but none of it felt connected to what he was experiencing in this moment. Atlas remained still, yet fully engaged, his posture aligned with the direction of the faint tire tracks they had discovered earlier. Daniel studied the ground again, letting his eyes trace the subtle compression of gravel that suggested recent passage. It was not dramatic, not obvious, but it carried intent, and intent always mattered more than visibility in situations like this. He exhaled slowly, then spoke into the radio in a measured tone, requesting access to perimeter camera feeds near the maintenance yard and the western service gate. After a brief pause, confirmation came through, and Daniel adjusted his position slightly, standing closer to Atlas as if maintaining a shared line of awareness. The wind moved gently through the facility, carrying with it the distant sound of equipment cycling and the faint hum of electricity that defined military order after sunset. Yet beneath that normal rhythm, there was still something unsettled, something that did not belong to routine. Atlas shifted his head slightly, ears angling toward the fence line, and Daniel noticed immediately. The dog was not reacting to sound alone, but to pattern, as if recognizing something that human observation had not yet fully formed. Moments later, a second voice came through the radio, this time from security control, confirming that the western camera feed had recorded movement approximately 20 minutes prior to the shed incident. Daniel focused immediately, requesting clarification without raising his voice, and the response that followed was brief but significant. A maintenance cart had passed through the service corridor without standard clearance verification, moving at a steady pace and exiting toward the outer access road. No personnel identification had been logged. Daniel absorbed this information without interruption, his expression steady but his internal awareness sharpening. Atlas remained fixed on the same direction, as if confirming the implication before it was fully spoken aloud. Daniel began walking slowly along the inside of the fence line, following the path that aligned with both the tire marks and the camera record. Atlas matched him step for step, maintaining close proximity without needing instruction. The facility lights behind them cast elongated shadows across the ground, and those shadows shifted with each movement, creating a sense of layered motion between present reality and recent past. As they walked, Daniel considered the timeline in silence. The shed ignition, the disturbed latch, the presence of the metal container, and now the unauthorized movement along the service corridor all formed a sequence that suggested coordination rather than coincidence. Atlas suddenly stopped near a section of fence where the ground appeared slightly more compressed than surrounding areas. Daniel knelt again, examining the subtle irregularity. There were faint impressions that did not match standard boot or vehicle patterns, suggesting someone had paused here briefly before continuing onward. Atlas lowered his head toward the ground, inhaling slowly, then lifted it again with focused attention toward the outer access road. Daniel placed a hand lightly on the dog's shoulder, not to guide him, but to confirm shared observation. The stillness between them felt deliberate, as if both were processing the same incomplete story from different perspectives. In the distance beyond the fence, the outer access road curved toward a maintenance junction used for supply delivery during daytime operations. Daniel knew that route well, and he also knew that it was not typically active after sunset unless scheduled in advance. He straightened and adjusted his stance, then requested a full personnel verification for any authorized movement in the past hour. The response came back negative for official clearance, confirming what the earlier observation had already suggested. Atlas remained alert, gaze fixed forward, his body language calm but entirely engaged. Daniel felt the weight of understanding forming gradually, not as sudden conclusion, but as alignment of scattered details. He looked down at Atlas and spoke quietly, not issuing command but acknowledging awareness. "We are not looking at an accident." The dog did not respond verbally, but his posture tightened slightly, as if agreement had been established without need for further explanation. The wind shifted again, this time carrying a cooler edge from the open fields beyond the facility boundary. Daniel turned his attention back toward the service gate and then beyond it, where the access road disappeared into darkness interrupted only by occasional distant lighting. He considered the possibility that whoever had passed through the corridor had not intended to remain nearby. Atlas took one small step forward, then stopped, waiting. Daniel followed, and together they moved toward the outer edge of the gate area, crossing from controlled environment into the threshold of uncertainty. The radio remained active but silent in content, offering no further clarity, only the steady reminder that operations continued elsewhere without awareness of their focus. Daniel paused one final time before fully stepping beyond the gate boundary, placing a hand briefly on Atlas as if confirming readiness not for confrontation, but for understanding. Atlas stood steady beside him, eyes forward, calm and attentive. In that moment, the shed was no longer the center of the situation. It had become the beginning of a wider pattern that stretched beyond sight, and both man and dog now stood within its expanding perimeter, ready to follow it wherever it led. The service gate behind Daniel Harper now felt less like a boundary and more like a threshold between what was known and what still needed to be understood. He and Atlas stood just beyond the controlled perimeter lights of Fort Ridge, Texas, where the ground shifted from uniform gravel to a rougher, less maintained stretch of access road used by supply vehicles and maintenance crews. The night air had cooled slightly, carrying a dry desert edge that replaced the earlier heat of the shed fire, yet the tension remained unchanged. Atlas walked slightly ahead, then paused, scanning the roadside with slow, deliberate focus. Daniel followed his line of sight, noticing how the German Shepherd was no longer reacting to immediate stimuli, but to direction, as if tracing an invisible path left behind by movement rather than sound. The tire impressions they had seen earlier were clearer here, cutting through the dust and leading toward a service junction that connected to a secondary road used for off-schedule logistics. Daniel knelt briefly, confirming the alignment of the tracks, then rose again, his attention shifting between the ground and the horizon. The radio on his shoulder remained quiet for several seconds before a soft update came through confirming that no authorized convoy had been logged in this sector during the time frame in question. That confirmation settled into Daniel's awareness with increasing weight, not as alarm, but as clarity. Atlas suddenly stopped again, this time near a patch of disturbed gravel where the road widened slightly before narrowing into a darker corridor of brush and fencing. His posture changed subtly, ears angled forward, body still but fully engaged. Daniel stepped closer and looked down, noticing faint drag marks that did not match vehicle movement, but suggested something had been pulled or guided through the area. He did not speak immediately. Instead, he allowed the silence to hold, observing how Atlas responded to the environment without hesitation. The dog's attention was fixed forward, beyond the curve of the road where visibility dropped into uneven shadow. Daniel placed a hand briefly on Atlas's shoulder, a grounding gesture that had become instinctive between them over time. It was not command, not reassurance, but alignment. The wind moved lightly across the open stretch, carrying dust and the faint scent of distant machinery from deeper within the installation. Daniel straightened and began walking again, following the direction Atlas had chosen without needing verbal instruction. The German Shepherd moved ahead with controlled confidence, occasionally pausing to confirm Daniel's position before continuing forward. As they advanced along the access road, the environment grew quieter, the structured noise of the facility fading behind them until only the natural sounds of night remained. Daniel checked the perimeter map on his handheld device briefly, noting that the path they were following intersected with an unmonitored service trail used for equipment transfers during daytime hours. Its current lack of activity made it an ideal route for anything or anyone attempting to move without detection. Atlas slowed near a slight bend in the road where the brush thickened on both sides. He stopped and looked into the darkness beyond the curve, holding his position with steady focus. Daniel joined him, scanning the same area. At first, there was nothing visible, only layered shadows formed by uneven terrain and sparse lighting from distant facility poles. Then Daniel noticed a faint reflective surface near the ground, partially hidden by brush. He moved a few steps closer, careful and deliberate, and realized it was a small piece of equipment casing, not standard issue for outdoor maintenance use. Atlas remained still, watching the same direction, as if confirming that this detail mattered. Daniel crouched beside the object, examining its placement rather than its identity. It had not been dropped casually. It had been set down or left behind with intention. He stood again and looked toward Atlas, who now shifted slightly forward, indicating continuation rather than conclusion. The path ahead curved further away from the facility lights, disappearing into a corridor of darkness broken only by faint ambient glow from the horizon. Daniel took a slow breath and adjusted his grip on the radio, but did not transmit. Instead, he continued forward with Atlas at his side, both moving in sync without urgency, but with certainty. The investigation had moved beyond observation. It had become pursuit of understanding through pattern, and each step forward revealed less about what had happened and more about what had been carefully arranged. Atlas moved first around the bend, then paused again, waiting. Daniel followed, and as he reached the curve, the road ahead opened into a longer stretch of unlit access path extending deeper into the outer perimeter of Fort Ridge. The night felt heavier here, not because of fear, but because of distance from certainty. Daniel placed a hand briefly on Atlas one more time, then lowered it, allowing the dog to lead without interruption. Together they moved forward into the darker stretch of road, following a sequence of signs that were still incomplete but undeniably connected, each step drawing them further into a situation that had begun with fire and was now unfolding into something far larger than either of them had yet fully named. The unlit stretch of access road beyond Fort Ridge, Texas, seemed to stretch longer the deeper Daniel Harper and Atlas moved into it, as if the installation itself was gradually giving way to a quieter and more uncertain edge of its own perimeter. The structured lighting from the main facility had faded behind them, replaced by scattered utility lamps that barely touched the ground in controlled intervals, leaving long sections of road in natural darkness. Daniel maintained a steady pace, his boots pressing into compact gravel that shifted slightly under each step, while Atlas continued ahead with a focused calm that had not wavered since they left the service gate. There was no urgency in the dog's movement, only direction, as if he was following a path that was already familiar to him in ways that had not yet been explained. Daniel checked the handheld device again, confirming their position relative to the maintenance map. The route they were on curved toward an older section of the installation used infrequently for storage and retired equipment, an area that had not been updated in recent operational logs. That detail added weight to the growing sense that what they were following was not accidental movement, but something structured around avoidance of observation. Atlas slowed as the road widened slightly into a clearing bordered by low fencing and weathered utility structures. Daniel stopped beside him and looked ahead, allowing his eyes to adjust to the reduced light. In the distance, partially obscured by a cluster of storage containers, he noticed the outline of a small maintenance cart parked at an angle that did not match standard placement protocols. The cart was idle, its surface reflecting faint ambient light, and it appeared to have been abandoned in haste rather than routine parking. Atlas approached it first, moving in a controlled arc around the object, then paused near its rear wheel. Daniel followed and knelt beside the cart, observing without touching it immediately. The surface bore light dust displacement patterns consistent with recent use, and there were faint scuff marks near the base that suggested it had been pushed or redirected off its intended route. He rose again slowly, scanning the surrounding area. The clearing itself felt unusually still, even for an unoccupied section of the facility. Atlas remained fixed on a point beyond the cart, toward a narrow path that led between two storage structures and disappeared into deeper shadow. Daniel adjusted his stance and followed the direction of the dog's focus. As they moved forward, the environment shifted subtly. The road surface became less maintained, transitioning into compacted earth mixed with gravel, and the structures on either side grew older, their surfaces marked by time and limited upkeep. Daniel noticed a second set of faint impressions in the ground, distinct from the earlier tire tracks, suggesting repeated movement along this alternate path. Atlas stopped again near the entrance of the narrow passage between structures. His posture tightened slightly, not in alarm but in heightened awareness. Daniel placed a hand briefly on his shoulder, then moved past him into the passage, allowing the dog to follow closely. The space between the structures reduced sound significantly, and the ambient noise of the wider installation faded almost completely. In this enclosed corridor of metal and aging concrete, even the wind felt distant. Daniel moved carefully, scanning both sides as he advanced. Atlas stayed within a step of him, occasionally glancing toward corners and edges where visibility narrowed. Halfway through the passage, Daniel noticed a small marking on one of the structure walls, a faded symbol or identifier partially obscured by weathering and time. It was not immediately recognizable, but its placement suggested organizational significance rather than random graffiti or damage. He paused briefly to observe it, then continued forward. As they neared the end of the passage, the space opened into another small clearing, larger than the previous one, but still enclosed by surrounding structures and fencing. In the center of this area stood a low utility platform with several containers arranged in a semi-organized pattern. One of the containers had its lid slightly ajar, allowing a faint gap of darkness within. Atlas moved toward it first and stopped just short of contact, holding position as if confirming presence rather than reacting to it. Daniel approached slowly and crouched beside the container, noticing that its placement was deliberate, aligned with the edge of the platform rather than randomly set down. He did not open it. Instead, he studied the arrangement around it. The spacing between objects, the direction of minor disturbances in the dust, and the absence of typical maintenance indicators all suggested recent and controlled activity. Daniel stood again, his attention shifting between Atlas and the surrounding environment. The dog remained focused on the container but showed no distress, only attention, as if waiting for a decision to be made. Daniel exhaled slowly, then stepped back to reassess the clearing as a whole. This was not a site of chaos or abandonment. It was a point of transition, where movement had paused but not ended. He reached for his radio but hesitated before transmitting, choosing instead to observe a few moments longer. Atlas finally turned his head away from the container and looked toward the far edge of the clearing, where another narrow exit led into deeper terrain beyond the structured boundaries of Fort Ridge. Daniel followed his gaze and understood that this path extended further than what they had already uncovered. Whatever had begun at the shed fire had not been contained, and the trail they were following was not leading back toward resolution, but forward into something still unfolding. He placed a steady hand on Atlas, then lowered it, and together they moved toward the next opening, continuing into the quiet structure of the unknown without breaking their measured pace. The narrow passage beyond the utility clearing opened into a longer corridor of uneven terrain where the structured layout of Fort Ridge, Texas began to dissolve into something more natural and less controlled. Daniel Harper and Atlas moved forward at a steady pace, both of them fully committed now to the direction the trail was revealing. The air here was cooler, carrying faint traces of dry grass and distant machinery, but the dominant feeling was still absence, as if this section of land had been deliberately left out of regular observation cycles. Daniel scanned both sides of the path as they advanced, noting how the fencing gradually shifted from reinforced installation barriers to older, simpler boundaries that looked maintained only when necessary. Atlas walked slightly ahead, then slowed again, his attention locked forward in a way that Daniel had learned to trust more than any map or report. There was no hesitation in the dog's movement, only continuity, as if every step was part of a sequence already understood. Daniel adjusted his pace to match, keeping his presence close but allowing Atlas to lead. The path eventually widened into a long strip of ground bordered by scattered equipment storage units that appeared older than the rest of the facility. Some of them showed faded identification markings, barely legible under layers of dust and time. The lighting was minimal here, limited to a few distant poles that cast weak illumination across uneven ground. As they moved deeper into this section, Daniel noticed that the subtle disturbances in the terrain were becoming more consistent, forming a directional pattern that aligned with the route Atlas had chosen since leaving the service gate. It was no longer a matter of isolated clues. It was a continuous line. Atlas stopped suddenly at the edge of a slight incline where the ground dipped toward a lower section of the facility boundary. Daniel approached and looked down, noticing faint impressions in the soil that suggested repeated passage along this descent. The dog's posture changed again, not tense but fully attentive, as if confirming that they had reached a critical point in the sequence they had been following. Daniel crouched briefly, running his eyes over the terrain. The impressions were subtle but organized, indicating controlled movement rather than random travel. He stood again and looked toward the lower stretch of ground where the path continued into a darker corridor bordered by sparse vegetation and utility fencing that appeared less frequently maintained. The wind shifted gently through the area, carrying with it a cooler draft that suggested open space beyond the facility's structured perimeter. Daniel placed a steady hand on Atlas, then released it, allowing the dog to move forward first. Atlas descended the incline with careful steps, maintaining balance and focus as he moved into the lower section of terrain. Daniel followed closely, adjusting his footing to match the uneven surface. As they reached the bottom, the environment changed again. The ground flattened into a wider stretch of compact earth, and the fencing on either side became less uniform, with gaps that suggested transitions between controlled zones and open land. Daniel observed how the lighting from the facility behind them no longer reached this far, leaving the area illuminated only by ambient night glow and faint reflections from distant infrastructure. Atlas continued forward until he reached a point where the path intersected with a secondary trail cutting across the landscape at a shallow angle. He stopped there and looked both directions, holding position as if evaluating the continuation of the route. Daniel stepped beside him and examined the intersection carefully. One direction led toward what appeared to be an older access road marked by weathered signage, while the other extended into darker terrain that sloped gently away from the facility boundary. Neither path showed clear dominance in terms of use, but Atlas's attention remained fixed toward the second option. Daniel followed his gaze and studied the darkness ahead. There were faint indicators of passage there as well, subtle enough to be overlooked without focused attention, but consistent enough to suggest recent movement. Daniel inhaled slowly, then checked his radio briefly without transmitting. The situation had become less about immediate reporting and more about continuity of observation. Atlas took a few steps forward along the darker route, then paused again, waiting. Daniel moved with him, maintaining close proximity as they advanced deeper into the outer edge of Fort Ridge's controlled environment. The sense of structure behind them was now almost entirely gone, replaced by open terrain that extended beyond the reach of standard facility oversight. The night air here felt wider, less confined, and the silence carried more depth than before. Daniel's awareness remained steady, not driven by urgency, but by accumulation of detail. Each step revealed less about isolated events and more about a connected path that had been unfolding beyond official visibility. Atlas continued forward without hesitation, guiding the direction with calm certainty. Daniel followed, understanding that they were no longer retracing or investigating a single incident. They were moving along a line that had been carefully extended beyond the edges of normal reporting, into terrain where every sign mattered equally and nothing could be dismissed as coincidence. Together they advanced into the darker stretch of land, where the boundaries of Fort Ridge faded completely and only the continuity of the trail remained. The darkness beyond Fort Ridge, Texas, had fully closed in around Daniel Harper and Atlas, turning the open terrain into a wide and quiet expanse where visibility depended more on instinct than light. The structured presence of the United States Marine Corps installation was now distant behind them, reduced to faint glows along the horizon that no longer influenced the immediate environment. Ahead, the ground stretched unevenly into a low valley of compact soil and scattered brush, shaped by years of weather and infrequent human passage. Daniel maintained a steady pace, his breathing controlled, his attention divided between the terrain and Atlas, who continued to lead with unwavering focus. The German shepherd moved with deliberate confidence, pausing only occasionally to confirm direction before continuing forward. There was no hesitation in his behavior, only alignment with something that Daniel was still assembling piece by piece through observation. The path they followed gradually narrowed again, forming a corridor of natural barriers on both sides, where taller grass and low vegetation began to obscure the edges of movement. Daniel slowed slightly, allowing his eyes to adjust further as the ambient light diminished. The wind shifted gently through the corridor, carrying cooler air from open land beyond the facility's reach. Atlas suddenly stopped, his body lowering slightly into a focused stance as he looked ahead into the narrowing path. Daniel stepped beside him and followed his gaze. At first, there was only darkness, layered and uneven, but after a moment, he noticed a faint irregularity in the distance, a subtle disruption in the continuity of the terrain. It was not movement, but evidence of movement, a suggestion that something had passed through recently and continued further into the open land beyond. Daniel crouched briefly, studying the ground where the path narrowed. The impressions here were less structured than before, more scattered, but still consistent in direction. Atlas remained still, eyes locked forward, as if confirming that they were approaching a point of significance rather than conclusion. Daniel stood again and adjusted his position, placing himself slightly behind Atlas while maintaining a clear line of sight. The dog moved forward first, and Daniel followed, both of them entering a wider section of open terrain where the vegetation thinned and the ground flattened into a broad stretch of earth extending toward the outer boundary of Fort Ridge. In the distance, faint silhouettes of utility poles marked the transition between controlled installation land and open surrounding property. Daniel checked his handheld device again, noting that they were now beyond standard internal mapping coverage. That detail confirmed what he had already begun to understand. Whatever trail they were following was no longer contained within routine operational zones. Atlas continued forward until he reached a slight rise in the terrain and stopped. Daniel approached and looked over the rise, where the ground extended downward into a shallow basin surrounded by uneven brush and scattered debris carried by wind. In the center of this basin, barely visible at first, was a faint linear disturbance cutting across the ground, too consistent to be natural erosion. Daniel focused on it, recognizing that it aligned with the direction they had been following since leaving the maintenance clearing. Atlas stood at his side, his attention unwavering, body aligned toward the same direction. Daniel felt the weight of the pattern settle more clearly now. This was not a sequence of random points. It was a continuous path that had been carefully maintained through minimal disturbance, suggesting deliberate movement rather than incidental passage. The realization did not bring urgency, but clarity. He placed a steady hand on Atlas, then lowered it, allowing the dog to continue forward into the basin first. Atlas descended without hesitation, his steps measured and controlled. Daniel followed, maintaining distance but never losing alignment. As they reached the lower ground, the air felt slightly different, more open, as if the terrain itself had expanded outward beyond the structured influence of the facility. Daniel scanned the basin carefully, noting how the faint path continued through it and extended toward the far side where the terrain rose again into another low ridge. Atlas paused in the center of the basin and looked toward that ridge, holding position as if confirming the next stage of movement. Daniel joined him and followed his line of sight. The ridge ahead was darker, less defined, blending into the surrounding night landscape, but it represented continuity rather than termination. Daniel exhaled slowly, then adjusted his grip on the radio without transmitting. The situation had moved beyond immediate reporting thresholds and into sustained tracking of a pattern that was still unfolding. Atlas took a few steps forward again, then paused, waiting for Daniel to match pace. Daniel stepped forward beside him, and together they continued across the basin toward the rising terrain beyond it, moving deeper into a path that no longer reflected isolated incidents, but a structured progression leading further into the unknown perimeter of Fort Ridge. The rise beyond the basin stretched into a low ridge line that marked the final transition between controlled United States Marine Corps territory at Fort Ridge, Texas, and the open land beyond its structured perimeter. Daniel Harper and Atlas moved steadily upward, their pace synchronized by repetition and mutual awareness rather than instruction. The night air here felt thinner, carrying less of the facility's mechanical presence and more of the natural stillness that came from open terrain untouched by regular patrol routes. Daniel's focus remained sharp, but not hurried. Every step now felt like continuation rather than pursuit, as if the trail they had been following had reached its final expression rather than its midpoint. Atlas led the ascent without hesitation, his posture calm but fully engaged, eyes fixed on the ridge ahead where the ground leveled before dropping slightly into an unseen far side. As they reached the top, Daniel paused, allowing his vision to expand across the landscape beyond. The terrain opened into a wide stretch of uneven field, bordered by sparse vegetation and broken lines of fencing that no longer matched any active operational map. In the distance, faint silhouettes of rural infrastructure marked the edge of civilian land, blending naturally into the night. Atlas stepped forward a few feet and stopped, his attention locked on a single point ahead. Daniel followed his gaze and noticed it immediately. A small structure stood partially obscured by brush and shadow, older than the surrounding land features, its outlines softened by age and limited maintenance. There were no lights, no movement, and no signs of recent activity at first glance. But something about its positioning aligned precisely with the direction of every previous indicator they had followed from the shed onward. Daniel crouched slightly, studying the distance. The structure was isolated, not part of any visible network of roads or marked pathways, yet it sat at a convergence point where multiple faint terrain lines appeared to meet. Atlas remained still beside him, posture steady, eyes fixed forward without deviation. Daniel felt the weight of the pattern fully aligned now, not as speculation but as completion of sequence. He raised his handheld device briefly, confirming that they were now fully outside Fort Ridge operational jurisdiction, in an unmonitored boundary zone where official tracking ended. That realization did not create urgency. It created understanding. Whatever had begun with fire inside a shed had not been contained within facility limits from the start. It had extended outward with intention, following paths designed to avoid detection rather than attract it. Daniel stood slowly, placing a hand briefly on Atlas, as if acknowledging shared recognition of the moment. The German shepherd did not move immediately. Instead, he maintained focus on the structure ahead, as if confirming that the endpoint of their movement was not accidental but inevitable. The wind passed gently through the open field, carrying the faint scent of dry earth and distant vegetation. Daniel began walking forward again, and Atlas matched him instantly. Their descent from the ridge was controlled and steady, each step reducing the distance between observation and conclusion. As they approached the structure, details became clearer. It was not abandoned in the sense of neglect, but in the sense of deliberate separation from active systems. The exterior showed signs of careful placement rather than decay, as if it had been positioned to remain unnoticed rather than forgotten. Daniel stopped at a safe distance, scanning the surroundings first. No movement, no immediate presence, only stillness shaped by isolation. Atlas stood beside him, then took a few steps forward and stopped again, indicating that the final point of the trail lay directly ahead. Daniel exhaled slowly, then lowered his radio without transmitting, choosing instead to rely on direct observation. He and Atlas advanced together toward the structure, closing the remaining distance without breaking formation. At the threshold of the clearing surrounding it, Daniel paused one final time, eyes scanning every angle. The structure remained silent, unchanged, but no longer separate from the pattern they had been following. Atlas stood steady at his side, calm and fully present, as if confirming that the path which began with fire had now led them here, to a place where everything they had observed converged into a single unresolved point waiting just beyond reach.